News of the Times, The One Penny Wife, Starvation, Poison and the Law. True crime from 1829. Today, we're going back to 1829, a year when the English law allowed for something extraordinary. A person could be condemned for murder even if the victim lived. Our story begins inside a marriage that had once been warm before it soured into something far more dangerous. A wife kept on a starvation allowance of a penny a day. A husband whose affection had curdled into neglect and threat. And a household where a single cup of tea would soon pull the parish surgeon into a case that tested the limits of early forensic science. Because when Mary Jardine collapsed, the symptoms were unmistakable, but the science to prove them was not. Doctors had only the crudest tools, an experimental stomach pump, improvised chemical reactions, and the instincts of a profession still decades away from reliable toxicology. What followed would bring the case before the court under one of the strangest statutes ever left on the books, and end on a scaffold in a way that left observers questioning whether justice had been done at all. This is the story later whispered about as the one penny wife, and the man whose intentions proved more important than their outcome. And in further particulars today, we leave the perils of poison, the perils of courtship, with the breach of promise tale reminding us that in the 19th century, even a cancelled engagement could end up before a judge. So, make yourself comfortable and imagine briefly the world of Jane Austen. Through our heroine today occupies one of its darker corners where romance gives way to something far more perilous. To understand what follows, we need to step fully into the world of 1829, a time when a wife whose husband had withdrawn his affections had very few choices indeed. A woman could not independently rent a room, sign a contract, bring a case to court, or even keep her own wages without her husband's permission. If he stopped supporting her, she might appeal to the parish for relief, but this usually meant the workhouse, a place of coarse labour, rigid rules, and the loss of nearly every comfort she had known. Separation was possible only in the most desperate circumstances, and even then the law granted a wife little more than the clothes on her back. Domestic life was physically demanding. Water carried by hand, meals coaxed from scant ingredients, coal fires tended, linens scrubbed by arm and bucket. Most working-class women lived in a world defined by duty, to the hearth, the children, and above all, to the man whose name they carried. A husband's goodwill, or lack of it, shaped every corner of a wife's existence. If he was kind, the home could be a haven. If he grew cold, neglectful, or cruel, there were no courts to compel him, no income she could claim, and no legal shield she could raise. It was into this world where love could be security and the loss of it could be ruin that Mary Jardine found herself drifting penny by penny into danger. John and Mary Jardine. John Jardine was a former bombardier in the Royal Artillery, a man who had once served his country abroad, earned himself a modest pension, and for many years appeared to be a steady and affectionate husband. He had married Mary more than a decade earlier, taking on not only a wife but her 3 children from a previous marriage, all of whom he treated by every early account with kindness and paternal care. For the first 15 years there seemed to have been a respectable working-class marriage, the sort found in countless small houses off the Kent Road, simple, stable, and unremarkable. But around about 1824, something shifted. Jardine fell into the company of what the newspapers delicately called loose women, and from that point his affections cooled. Indifference hardened into neglect, and neglect deepened into open dislike. He withdrew financial support, forcing Mary to seek relief from the parish of Woolwich. She was taken into the workhouse, an institution as bleak in 1829 as it is infamous today, and part of Jardine's pension was legally attached for her maintenance. Unwilling to see his pension diminished, Jardine arranged to take her out again, and by the autumn of 1828, the Jardines were living in a cramped room on Theobald Street on the Old Kent Road. Their marriage, once steady, was now a quiet battleground of starvation, threats, and simmering resentment. It was here between 9 and 10 in the morning that Mary poured water from the tea kettle for her breakfast, and nothing would ever be the same again. From the Morning Herald in London, the 1st of October, 1828. On Monday, the wife of a bombardier belonging to the Royal Artillery, at present a pensioner of that corps, obtained a warrant against her husband, whom she accused of attempting to poison her by putting a quantity of arsenic into the tea kettle. The warrant was placed in the hands of the younger Harris, who went and apprehended the man, whose name is John Gordon, charged with the heinous offence. The prosecutrix states that she lately lived in a small house in Theobald Street on the Old Kent Road, and had been married to the prisoner for 16 years. In the year 1824 he began to ill-treat her, from which period to 1826 he continued to abuse her, and when they then separated, she obtained a situation in a gentleman's family, but was under the necessity of quitting it on account of ill health. Her husband having obtained a pension, and she being incapable of procuring subsistence, she applied to the parish of Woolwich for support. She was then placed in the workhouse, and part of her husband's pension was obtained by the parish toward her maintenance. On Saturday fortnight, at her husband's solicitation, she came to London and lodged in the house to which allusion had been made. When there, they frequently quarrelled. He only allowed her 2d a day for provisions, approximately £1 in 2026, and she said that he had often declared he would do for her. On Monday morning he sat down to breakfast, and after drinking a cup and a half of tea, she began exceedingly sick. Previously, when the kettle was on the fire, she saw her husband with the lid in his hand. The woman at whose house she lodged ran off to fetch a surgeon, who brought the stomach pump and extracted the contents of the stomach, which were strongly impregnated with arsenic. Mr. Boast, the gentleman who had been called in, stated that he found the prosecutrix very sick when he entered, and that her stomach was much swollen. He immediately applied the stomach pump, and on examining the contents which he extracted, he found strongly impregnated with arsenic. He also analysed the remainder of the water left in the tea kettle, which he likewise found contained a quantity of arsenic. The poor woman expressed an anxious desire not to press the charge, but the magistrate told her that the case was too serious not to proceed. The duty he owed the public compelled him to oblige her to state what facts she knew, although they incriminated her husband. In addition to what she had previously stated, it was intimated that on Monday evening, before she took the poisoned liquid, the prisoner said, she having declared that she would proceed to Union Hall to seek redress on account of his allowing her so inadequate a sum to preserve existence, perhaps you will not be able to go. Mr. Chambers told the prisoner that he should remand him. Nevertheless, he would hear anything he pleased to say by the way of answer to the serious accusation. If, however, the magistrate's advice were taken, the prisoner would not say anything, as it might tend to incriminate himself. The prisoner disregarded the suggestion and entered into a lengthy statement embracing a period of some years. In 1826, he described himself as living most unhappily together. He accounted for his absence from her for a considerable period by being called on public duty, having served with his regiment in the last expedition to Portugal, where he was seized with paralysis, for which he obtained a pension. He then entered into a lengthy explanation respecting the reduction which had been made in his pension on account of the allowance afforded his wife by the parish of Woolwich. With regard to the trifle which he gave her to subsist on, he said it was the half of what he had, and when his pension, which he knew was due tomorrow, was paid, he told her she should share it with him. She here said, "But you had a good watch in your pocket, which you might have disposed of to keep me from starving." Mr. Chambers asked the prisoner if he had any observation to make as to the charge of attempting to poison his wife. The prisoner said, "I solemnly declare that I am an innocent man. My wife told me on Friday last that she would do something which should get me hanged or deported." The prosecutrix denied having used such an expression. The prisoner was decently attired, and during the investigation conducted himself with the greatest propriety. He never appeared in the slightest degree confused, nor did he betray any emotion on being told that the facts assumed a very serious character. He is a Scotsman and appears to be about 40 years of age. The prisoner was remanded to Tuesday next. Although the case appears simple on the surface, it sits at a fascinating crossroads in early forensic practice. This was an era when the stomach pump was still a novel contrivance, and when detecting arsenic relied on precarious pre-marsh methods that often raised more questions than answers. To understand the case properly, we need to step briefly into that evolving scientific landscape. The stomach pump was a relatively new medical invention in the early 19th century, introduced around 1820 as a device to remove poisons or dangerous substances before they could be absorbed. Prior to its use, physicians were limited to inducing vomiting or relying on crude emetics, neither reliable nor swift. The pump allowed liquid and stomach contents to be drawn out mechanically, offering for the first time a practical chance of saving a poisoned patient and preserving material for examination. Its arrival marked a significant step towards modern forensic medicine, although early practitioners often struggled with unfamiliar technique, inconsistent results, and public suspicion of such an intrusive device. Arsenic testing. Before the arrival of the Marsh test in 1836, detecting arsenic was a precarious business. Arsenic was cheap, tasteless, easily obtained, and so widely suspected in domestic murders that it became known as the inheritance powder. Yet the tests available to early investigators, simple heating, colour changes, or precipitation reactions, were notoriously unreliable. Results could be faint, ambiguous, or destroyed by improper technique, and defence lawyers frequently challenged them as a mere chemist's guesswork. In this climate, proving arsenic poisoning was often little more than educated speculation, making the later Marsh test revolutionary. It finally offered a clear, demonstrable metallic deposit that could persuade both judges and juries. But in the period of this case, such certainty was still out of reach. Despite being held for attempted poisoning, John Jardine did not appear to understand the severity of his position. With Mary still alive, he imagined the worst he faced was a brief imprisonment, and, relying on his respectable military service, he fully expected leniency. Settled in his cell, he wrote to his wife asking her to dismiss the accusation, entirely unaware that the case had already advanced too far for personal reconciliation to halt it. From the Morning Herald, London, the 8th of October, 1828. John Jordan, or Gordon, for by both names he had been designated, but whose real name is Jardine, the bombardier pensioned from the Royal Artillery, charged with maliciously attempting to poison his wife by putting a large quantity of arsenic into a tea kettle filled with water, was yesterday brought before R.J. Chambers, Esquire, for final examination and fully committed to take his trial for the capital offence. On Monday morning, his wife received a letter from him, of which the following is a copy. Dear wife, I write these few lines to inform you of the melancholy situation that I am in. You are well aware that I am innocent of the crime I am accused of, as innocent as the babe that is unborn. You may on that account think what my state and condition must be. I beg you will come and see me on Monday, as you will have permission from 12 to 2 o'clock, when I am persuaded that a mutual reconciliation will take place between us, which is the desire of your unfortunate husband, addressed to Mrs. Mary Jordan, 6 Theobald Street, the New Kent Road. Harriet Showell, the landlady at whose house the prosecutrix and prisoner were living when the unfortunate circumstance implicating him transpired, proved having used water from the butt whence the prosecutrix took with which she filled the kettle, and that she was as not ill. Besides this fact being proved, Mr. Boast, the surgeon who applied the stomach pump, stated that he had analysed the water remaining in the water butt and found it in a pure state. Since the prisoner was last examined, his personal appearance has undergone considerable change. He protests his innocence of the crime as confidently as before, and did not betray any symptoms of apprehension. The case now moved to trial, but under an unusual legal provisions for the time. A recently updated statute allowed prosecutors to treat the attempt to kill with poison as equivalent to murder, even if the victim survived. In other words, the law no longer required a body. The deliberate administration of a deadly substance with intent to kill was deemed, to all intents and purposes, wilful murder. It was under this more modern interpretation that Jardine now stood before the court. From the Morning Herald of London, 1st of January, 1829. John Jardine, a robust-looking man, was capitally indicted under the statute for administering in the parish of Newington a certain deadly poison called arsenic to his Mary, wife, with the intent to murder her. The indictment was founded upon a recent statute which extended and continued an older statute. By this act, the administering of any deadly drug or poison with intent to occasion death, although death did not actually ensue, was declared to be, to all intents and purposes, wilful murder. The prosecution went on to describe how John Jardine had spent his early years in the Bombardiers, earning the small pension of £1 and sixpence a day as the reward of long service. How he had married Mary 25 years earlier, when she was a widow with 3 children, and for the first 15 years no husband could have been more affectionate. How in time Jardine fell into the company of what the newspapers termed loose women, and under their influence his affections cooled. Indifference became neglect, and neglect hardened into a settled dislike. While they still lived together, the prisoner was accustomed to allow his wife the scant sum of 1 penny a day for her subsistence, an allowance so miserably inadequate that the unfortunate woman was in truth slowly sinking under the pressure of want. At length, unable to endure her condition, she applied for parochial relief and was received into the workhouse. But as the charge for her maintenance then exceeded the paltry pittance he had chosen to give her at home, the prisoner, resenting the deduction from his own pension, removed her once more to his lodging, and from that moment the system of starvation was renewed, and thus the wife of 25 years was again left to subsist on a daily allowance that no human creature could long endure. The prisoner resumed all his harsh treatment towards his wife, and became even more sparing of his allowance to her than he had been before. He took every opportunity of manifesting his dislike to her. He reduced her maintenance to 4 pence a day, value approximately £2 in 2026, and finally to 2 pence, value approximately £1 in 2026, which pittance he often gave to her with one hand, while the other he tauntingly displayed some sovereigns. The wife threatened to complain again to a magistrate, and was desired to do her utmost. Upon one occasion his reply to her threats was a little more remarkable. He said to her, "You do not know whether you will be able to go." The next morning the wife rose before the prisoner, and having got the breakfast things ready and set the tea kettle upon the fire, went downstairs on some little errand to her landlady. Upon her return, the prisoner was up, but only partially dressed. He had the lid of the kettle in his hand, but this did not strike the wife as anything unusual, as he was in the habit of taking water out of it to shave in the morning. She therefore unsuspectingly poured the water into the teapot and drank 1.5 cups of the liquid, when she felt seized with a sickness at the stomach. Her pain increased and became very violent. The prisoner was walking up and down the room laughing at her. Her cries at length brought the landlady into the room, and the prisoner then took up his hat and walked out of the house. He had not been in the habit of taking any of his meals with his wife. The landlady advised that a doctor should be sent for, and a gentleman who would be examined today was called in. He immediately saw that the woman had been poisoned, but applying the stomach pump, he had the good fortune to extract the contents of the stomach before the hurtful drug could take any great effect. The produce of his labours was submitted to the usual chemical tests, and the result was the detection by unerring evidence of arsenical poisoning. The parish, upon a representation made in the proper quarter, had the prisoner taken into custody, and he was regularly committed for trial. These were the facts of the case, and the learned counsel concluded by hoping that they would be dispassionately viewed by the jury. Mrs. Jardine proved the circumstance as opened. The miserable woman looked in dreadful health, and she is said to be still under the hands of the doctor from the effects of the poison. Mr. Boast, the surgeon called to attend Mrs. Jardine, found her in violent distress, her stomach distended, her symptoms unmistakably pointing to poison. He applied the stomach pump, removing water and fragments of bread. At first Nothing seemed unusual, but on examining the contents later, he found them highly impregnated with arsenic. He then inspected the tea kettle from which Mary had taken her morning water. Along the inner surface clung a dusting of white powder. There was, he told the court, enough arsenic present to destroy a number of people. Had the pump not been used, the case would have been fatal. The water butt from which the kettle had been filled was entirely clean. To confirm his suspicions, Mr. Bose performed the usual tests. In the first sample, the addition of potato and sulphate of copper produced the distinctive apple green precipitate of arsenic. A second test yielded the same result, and a third, burning a small portion, gave off the unmistakable garlic smell known to every medical man of the time. These experiments, he concluded, leave no doubt whatever that arsenic had been administered. When called upon for his defence, Jardine denied all knowledge of the poisoning and insisted the whole affair was a conspiracy against him. He declared that several respectable persons were present to speak to his good character. Their names were called, Major Campbell among them, but no one came forward. It later emerged that none had received proper notice to attend. The defence, such as it was, collapsed into silence. The learned judge summed up the evidence to the jury, leaving it to them to say whether, upon the evidence of the surgeon, there could be any doubt of the prisoner's intention of destroying his wife by administering poison to her. The jury retired, and after some time returned a verdict of guilty. Mr. Baron Vaughan then desired the prisoner to be called upon to say why the sentence of death should not be passed upon him. The wretched man was mute. His lordship put on the awful black cap, and, addressing the prisoner in a forcible and impressive manner, exposed the awful consequences to which his offence, if it had not been interrupted, would have led. He concluded by imploring him to make use of the short time that he had to live in making amends for his crime, for that no hope of pardon could be held out to him, and then awarded him to execution. In prison, still hoping for the prospect of mercy, Jardine held fast for his plea of innocence, and he insisted that he had been framed. His wife Mary implored the learned judge to spare his life in the most impassioned terms, but the case was of so aggravated a nature, his lordship told her that justice must take its course, and the gates of mercy were forever closed in this world to her unhappy husband. Jardine's protests grew louder as the appointed day drew near, but they carried no weight. The law was clear. Under the statute of the time, the administering of poison with intent to kill was, in every sense, treated as wilful murder. And so, the man whose wife had survived would nevertheless meet the fate reserved for those who had taken her life. On the morning of his execution, he mounted the scaffold alongside another condemned man, a horse thief. The two crimes, so different in nature, now levelled into the same grim conclusion. Such was the character of English justice in 1829. Intent weighed as heavily as outcome, and the gallows waited for both alike. From the Morning Herald, the 20th of January 1829, execution at Horsemonger Lane. Yesterday morning, vast numbers of persons assembled outside and opposite in the vicinity of the above prison to witness the execution of J. Jardine, aged 43, and W. Page, aged 24. Jardine was convicted at the late Kingston Assizes under a recent enactment for administering poison to his wife for the purpose of depriving her of life. At 8 o'clock the chapel bell commenced tolling, and soon afterwards the criminals were removed from their cells to the chapel of the jail, where Dr. Mann, Mr. Walter, the governor, and others had assembled. After a short time engaged in prayer, Jardine was led out of the chapel into the yard by two officers, and the executioner commenced pinioning him. He appeared a very fine, athletic man with a florid complexion and good countenance. During the operation he conducted himself with great firmness, although he trembled from exposure to the cold. Jardine, being placed under the fatal beam, complained of the cold, and having requested the ear of the governor, declared his innocence, but told him, Mr. Walter, to tell his wife that he forgave her. The confidence of Page was shaken in his last moments, and bursting into tears, he exclaimed, "Oh, my poor mother and sister, this sight would break your hearts." Every preparation for their final exit being completed, Dr. Mann descended the gallows, and, on a signal, the two unfortunate beings were launched into eternity. Jardine, from his weight, appeared to suffer little, but Page struggled very much. In the late 1820s, England's capital laws were still severe to the point of contradiction. Dozens of offences, from violent assault to the theft of a single animal, could bring a man to the same drop. Reforms were stirring in Parliament, but they would come too late for John Jardine. To the public of the time, crimes of violence and crimes against property were rarely distinguished in their moral weight. The intention to harm, whether a wife or a neighbour's horse, was enough to mark a man as fit for the gallows, and under the statute that governed Jardine's case, the care and law cared little for whether a victim lived or died. It was the purpose behind the act that made the deed murderous. As for Jardine himself, he went to his death insisting that he had been wronged. A conspiracy, he said, contrived to ruin him. Whether he believed this or clung to it as the only defence left to him is something the record cannot settle. What remains is a case that sits uneasily in the shadowy borderland between law, intention, and justice. And so the man whose wife survived the poisoning attempt met the fate reserved for murderers, while the country around him crept slowly towards a more measured age of criminal reform. Too slowly for some, and far too slowly for John Jardine. Further particulars. And now, as ever, we turn to further particulars, those moments in Victorian life that remind us the 19th century had its own relationship problems, although their solutions tended to involve the assizes rather more often than the modern couples might prefer. From the Illustrated Police News, the 10th of April, 1875, another breach of promise case. At the Kingston Assizes, the case of Donoghue versus Marshall had been tried before Mr. Joyce, QC. It was an action brought by a young woman named Anne Donoghue to recover damages from the defendant, John Marshall, for breach of his promise to marry her. The defendant pleaded that he was not under the promise. The plaintiff in the action is the daughter of a respectable working man who resides in Guildford Street in Southwark. The defendant is stated to be 23 years of age, and his father is represented to be an iron plate worker and in a large way of business. He lived with his father and mother opposite the house where the plaintiff was residing with Mrs. Kettle, a married sister. In the month of March 1872, the plaintiff went to Astley's Theatre with a Miss Reeves, and the defendant introduced himself to them and asked permission to see the plaintiff home, and he did so. The defendant then called upon Mrs. Kettle and asked her permission to correspond with the plaintiff. She referred to him to her father, and mother, and upon them giving their consent, the plaintiff appeared to have been received as the intended bride of the defendant, and she visited him at the house of his father and mother. He was in the habit of visiting the plaintiff at her sister's. He gave the plaintiff an engaged ring and promised her that he would soon put a wedding ring on her finger. The date was fixed to take place in May 1874, but it was postponed at the insistence of the defendant, and other days were fixed, but further postponements took place. Things went on in this way until February 1875, when, in consequence of the plaintiff not having been visited by the defendant for 2 or 3 days, she went to his father's house to inquire the reasons, and he then told her he was very sorry, but he could not marry her, and that the engagement must cease. The effect of this upon the plaintiff was that she fainted, and the defendant was represented to have run away, and to have left the plaintiff in this state, and she was escorted home by some strangers. In consequence of this proceeding, Mrs. Kettle, the sister of the plaintiff, went to the house of the defendant's father to ask for an explanation, and the father said that he had intended to give his son £50 for his wedding tour, but he had assented that the plaintiff had not got any money, and his son was likely to do very well, and he would not allow him to marry a girl who had money. He was subsequently ascertained that during the last 3 months that the intimacy had existed between the plaintiff and the defendant, and while he was still held himself out as her lover, he had been paying his addresses to another young woman to whom he had also promised marriage. Anne Donahue, the plaintiff, a rather good-looking young girl, was examined, and she proved the circumstances under which the promise was made, and she also proved that when the marriage was postponed in May 1874, the defendant promised that it should take place in May 1875. In cross-examination, the plaintiff said that the defendant, at the time he told her, could not marry her, and he said that his peace of mind was broken and that his father and mother would not permit him to marry her. He never told her himself that he would not marry her, but she had heard from another young lady that he was under an engagement to marry her. The defendant was in tears when he told her that he could not marry her, and he appeared to be very sorry. She knew nothing of the defendant till he introduced himself to her at Astley's Theatre in 1872, and at that time she was only 19 years old, and he was the same age. She gave him a promise that she would marry him when she was 20 old. She believed that the defendant was a manager for his father, but she never heard that he had only 24 shillings a week. His father had 8 or 9 children beside the defendant. The defendant was asked to stand up in the course of the case to be identified, but the witness stated amid much laughter that they never saw him dressed so shabbily before, and that he generally wore a suit of black and a ring on his finger. Mr. Thomas addressed the jury for the defendant, and he called his father to prove that he was only earning 25 shillings a week as a journeyman. The jury returned a verdict for the plaintiff, damages £25, value approximately £3,500 in 2026. I can hear the kettle beginning to mutter in the background. That usually means our time together has come to a close, and someone has remembered to keep an eye on the arsenic situation in the teapot. Always reassuring. If you've enjoyed wandering through the murkier corners of the 1820s with me, do consider tapping the like button. It keeps the algorithm from sulking in the hallway and refusing to come down for supper. And if you'd like early ad-free episodes, the full archive and assorted historical oddities, you'll find all that tucked neatly over at Patreon. Just a civil invitation, the Victorian way. This has been News of the Times, and I am Robin Coles, collector of obsolete railway timetables, amateur inventor of impractical mousetraps, and part-time enthusiast for medieval laundry techniques. I'll see you next time, and until then, if you ever find yourself alone on a cobblestone alley after dark with footsteps forming a suspicious duet behind you, don't look back, just run. Trust me, it's tradition.